I swore I'd never drive this road again. The narrow highway wound through the pines like a coiled snake, slick with patches of ice. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, not because of the snow falling harder now, but because of what waited at the end of this road. Montana. 3 years ago, I left this place with nothing but a suitcase, and a heart so shattered, I didn't think it could ever hold love again. I told myself I'd never come back. Not for family. Not for old friends. Not for the memories that clung to every crooked fence post and the scent of pine in the winter air. But here I was. The heater in my old Subaru rattled and hissed, doing little to chase away the cold seeping into my bones. The dashboard clock read 4:27 p.m., but the gray sky was already heavy with darkness. "It's just 2 weeks," I whispered under my breath, like saying it aloud would make it true. Go in, do the job, leave. No attachments. The truth, I didn't want to be here at all. I'd taken a temporary contract at the local clinic in the town where I grew up, more out of desperation than choice. Rent was overdue. My savings were gone. And maybe, just maybe, I thought if I worked nonstop, I could keep the memories at bay. But it wasn't working. The closer I got to the turnoff, the tighter my chest felt. My mind kept drifting back to that nursery. I never finished painting the tiny socks. I never got to fold the life I never got to meet. Some losses carve you hollow in places no one else can see. My therapist used to tell me healing isn't linear. That grief comes in waves. But as the town's welcome sign loomed ahead, I didn't feel healed. I felt like a woman driving straight back into the storm. She barely survived the first time. As I passed the faded sign that read, "Welcome to Cedar Hollow," a place to call home, I felt anything but welcome. The snow was falling harder now, big, heavy flakes that stuck to the windshield faster than my wipers could clear them. And yet somewhere deep in my chest, under the ache and the fear, I felt the faintest flicker of something I didn't want to name. Hope. No, this wasn't hope. This was survival. And survival meant getting through the next 2 weeks without letting this place or anyone in it see how broken I still was. As I turned onto Main Street, the headlights caught on a small, weathered bookstore. Light spilled out onto the snow, warm and golden against the gray. And through the frost-covered glass, I caught a glimpse of a man cradling a tiny bundle in his arms. The baby's cry cut through the muffled air, sharp and desperate. I pressed harder on the brake. For reasons I couldn't explain, my chest tightened. The snow crunched under my tires as I turned onto a narrow dirt road. The GPS insisted this was the way to Silver Creek Ranch. But as I crept forward, I couldn't shake the unease curling in my stomach. Towering pines lined both sides of the drive, their branches heavy with snow bending low, like they were bowing to some invisible weight. I wasn't sure why I'd taken this side job. Fixing an old piano at a ranch wasn't part of the plan. But when the call came through yesterday, the owner desperate for someone to look at his late wife's piano, before the winter storms hit, I said yes. Maybe because it felt easier than sitting alone in my rented room in town. The house came into view like a shadow in the snow. It was massive, an old Victorian farmhouse, painted a muted gray, with a wraparound porch that sagged slightly in the middle. A single light glowed in an upstairs window. Otherwise, the place looked deserted, almost forgotten by time. I parked beside a battered pickup truck and cut the engine. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the house through the windshield as snowflakes melted on the glass. Get in, do the job. Get out, I reminded myself. I had barely stepped onto the porch when I heard it. The baby's cry. It was faint at first, muffled by walls and storm winds, but then it grew louder, then high-pitched and desperate. Something tightened in my chest. Before I could knock, the front door opened. A man filled the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his flannel shirt. His eyes, gray-green like the pines outside, looked sharp, even in the dim light. For a moment, we just stared at each other. "You must be June Carter," he said finally, his voice deep, rough like gravel. "Yes, I managed. I'm here about the piano." He nodded once but didn't step aside. "Colt Harris, this is not the best time." Behind him, the cry rose again, sharper now. "Sounds like you've got your hands full," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. "My son. Caleb." Something about the way he said the name flat restrained made me glance past him. The house was warm but sparse, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and something sweeter. Baby powder, maybe. On a nearby armchair lay a folded baby blanket, the corner embroidered with the name Claire. Claire was my wife, Colt said, following my gaze. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "She passed away 4 months ago." My stomach twisted. "I'm sorry," I said, the words automatic. "Yeah." He stepped aside, then finally letting me in. "The piano's in the parlor. I'll show you." But as I followed him down the hallway, the cries grew louder. Each wail seemed to echo off the walls, rattling something loose in me I didn't want to name. We reached a small parlor at the back of the house. In one corner stood an upright piano, its polished wood dulled with dust. "This is it," Colt said. "It hasn't been touched since Claire. Well, you know." I nodded, setting down my bag of tools, but even as I knelt to inspect the keys, I couldn't focus. The sound of Caleb's crying bled through the floorboards, thin and relentless. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to work. "This isn't your problem," I told myself. "You're here for the piano. Nothing more." But deep down, I knew I was lying. As I pressed one of the keys, a soft off-pitch note rang out, broken like the house itself. And upstairs, the baby's cries cracked into something hoarse and raw. I swallowed hard, trying to block it out. But some sounds you can't ignore. The piano's middle keys were sticking. I pressed down on one, and the sound came out muffled like it hadn't been played in years. I traced the edge of the cracked ivory with my thumb and let out a quiet sigh. This wasn't going to be an easy fix. Colt had left the room, probably to tend to Caleb. I could still hear the faint sound of the baby crying somewhere upstairs. It rose and fell like a tide, filling the spaces between my thoughts. I shook my head and muttered under my breath, "This isn't why I'm here. Fix the piano, get paid, and leave. That's it. I didn't come back to Montana to make connections or open old wounds. I came here because the rent was due, and my options had run out. That was the only reason." But even as I told myself that, a part of me wasn't so sure. I wiped the dust off the piano's nameplate. J. Steinway and Sons, New York. A beautiful instrument once, but now neglected just like this house seemed to be. The baby's cries finally faded into silence. The quiet was almost worse. I caught myself glancing at the staircase, as if I could see through the walls, as if I needed to know Caleb was okay. I rubbed my arms and turned back to the keys. "Don't get involved. Don't get attached," I reminded myself. A gust of wind rattled the window beside me. I glanced outside. The sky had gone dark, heavy clouds churning in shades of charcoal and slate. Snowflakes swirled in erratic patterns faster than before. The storm was coming. I pulled my coat tighter around me and muttered, "Great. Just what I need." I had planned to finish this job in 2 or 3 days at most, but if the weather turned bad, I might be stuck here longer. The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The floor creaked behind me. I turned to see Colt standing in the doorway. His arms folded a faint shadow under his eyes. "I'll bring in more firewood before the storm hits," he said. "Forecast says it'll be a rough one." I nodded. "Thanks for the heads up." He lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say something else, but then he gave a curt nod and disappeared down the hall. I exhaled slowly and turned back to the piano. My fingers hovered over the keys, but my mind wasn't on the music anymore. All I could think about was the storm outside, and the storm brewing inside this house. "You're not here to save anyone," I told myself firmly. "You're not here to be saved either." But I wasn't sure I believed that. The wind howled like a living thing outside my window, rattling the glass so hard I thought it might shatter. Snow lashed against the house, in thick, blinding waves covering everything in white. I lay on the narrow cot in the guest room staring at the ceiling, as shadows from the flickering fire danced across it. Sleep wouldn't come, not with that sound echoing through the house. Caleb was crying again. It started as a soft whimper, then climbed to a piercing wail that cut through the walls like a knife, the kind of sound that dug under your skin and wouldn't let go. I rolled onto my side, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders. "It's not your responsibility," I whispered to myself. "You're just here to fix the piano, nothing more." But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shut it out. Not an hour passed, maybe 2. The crying didn't stop. It was relentless, desperate, like the little boy was pouring every ounce of his tiny body into it. I could hear footsteps pacing above me, Colt's deep voice murmuring something I couldn't make out. Then silence. Then another round of crying, louder this time. I pressed the heel of my hand against my forehead and let out a shaky breath. Why won't he eat? Why hasn't the crying stopped? Even though I hadn't seen Caleb up close yet, I could picture him, tiny fists curled tight, face blotchy and wet chest, rising and falling in uneven gasps. That image made my stomach twist. A loud crack from outside made me jolt. I rushed to the window just in time to see a massive pine branch snap under the weight of ice and crash to the ground below. The wind picked up even more screaming against the house, like it wanted in. I shivered and stepped back from the glass. The storm wasn't letting up anytime soon. I sat on the edge of the cot, rubbing my arms and trying to block out Caleb's cries. But the truth was, they reminded me too much of another sound I couldn't forget. A soft, shallow wail in a hospital delivery room. A nurse whispering, "I'm so sorry," as they wheeled away the tiny bundle I'd never get to hold. I clenched my fists in the blanket and shook my head. "Don't go there, June. Not now." But it was too late. The crashing upstairs broke into a hoarse, rasping sound that made my heart lurch. Something was wrong. I stood before I realized I'd moved my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. For a moment, I hovered by the door, staring at the faint line of light spilling into the hallway. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps on the stairs. A knock, sharp and frantic, on my door. Miss Carter Colt's voice called out rough and tight with panic. "Please, I need your help." The knock came again, harder this time, making the thin wooden door tremble. Miss Carter Colt's voice called through the storm of wind outside. "Please, I don't know what else to do." I froze. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I didn't move. "I can't get him to eat." Colt continued, his tone rougher now, as if he was trying to hold it together. "It's been hours. He's getting weaker." I swallowed hard, my heart thudding so loudly it drowned out the wind outside. "This isn't your problem," I told myself. "You're not here for him, or his child. You're here to fix a piano and leave." I forced my voice to sound steady. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harris. I'm not a nurse. I can't help you." There was a pause on the other side of the door, long enough that I thought he'd given up, but then his voice came again, lower, this time strained. "I wouldn't ask if there was another way. He hasn't taken a bottle since this afternoon. The pediatrician said it's probably the colic, but I can't get him to settle." I gripped the edge of the blanket around my shoulders tighter. "Call someone else, a neighbor, or the clinic in town." "We've tried," Colt said, almost pleading now. "The phone lines are down. Roads are blocked. The storm." He broke off with a sharp breath. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't serious. My fingers dug into the blanket. I could hear it again. Caleb's cries, thin and broken, now barely carrying over the howl of the wind. And with it another sound, one buried deep in my memory, the quiet whimper of my baby boy in the hospital, his fragile chest rising and falling, for those few short minutes before it didn't anymore. I clenched my teeth and forced the memory back. "I can't," I said hoarsely. "I'm sorry." The floor creaked outside as Colt shifted his weight. "I wouldn't ask this of you," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper now. "But I'm out of options." The vulnerability in his tone cut through me in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Don't get involved. Don't open that door," my mind screamed. But then Caleb's cry rose again, sharper this time. It was the sound of a baby running out of strength, the kind that clawed at some primal part of me I'd tried to bury. Before I could think better of it, I heard my own voice saying, "Fine." The word came out tight, like it was dragged from the deepest part of me. "Take me to him," I added quietly. There was a pause. Then Colt's boots shifted against the floorboards. "Thank you," he said softly. But as I wrapped my blanket tighter and reached for the doorknob, one thought ran through my mind like a warning bell. This is a mistake I'll regret. And yet, I opened the door anyway. Colt led the way down the hallway, his broad frame stiff as if he was holding himself together by sheer willpower. The crying grew louder with each step. But it wasn't the sharp, full-throated wail I'd expected. This sound was thinner, weaker. It made my stomach twist. We reached a small room at the end of the hall. The door was already ajar, warm light spilling out into the dark corridor. "Go on," Colt murmured, his voice almost breaking. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed to turn around to walk back to the guest room to pretend I hadn't heard the desperation in that baby's cry. But my feet carried me forward anyway. The nursery was sparse, but cozy walls painted a pale blue, a rocking chair in one corner, and a crib against the far wall. And in that crib was Caleb. He was so small, too small. His tiny fists flailed weakly, his little face blotchy and wet with tears. His lips quivered as he let out another sound, a broken, rasping sob that caught in his throat, like he didn't even have the strength to cry properly anymore. I froze in the doorway. A memory slammed into me like a wave. The delivery room, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the sound of a heart monitor flatlining, my baby's tiny body in the nurse's arms, his chest rising and falling so faintly it was barely there. And then, nothing. Miss Carter Colt's voice pulled me back. I blinked hard, forcing the tears back. Caleb's sobs weakened even further. "He hasn't taken a bottle in hours," Colt said quietly, standing over the crib. "I've tried everything." I wrapped my arms tightly around myself. "And you think I can fix this? I'm not a miracle worker, Mr. Harris." "I know," he said. "But the pediatrician said, sometimes a woman's touch helps. I don't know if it's her warmth or her scent or—" He cut himself off, shaking his head. I don't know what else to do." I looked down at Caleb again. His little chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Something deep inside me cracked. "This isn't what I do," I whispered. "I'm not a mother. You're the only one here who might be able to help," Colt said. "Please." For a long moment I stood there, my fingers digging into the fabric of my sweater. Then Caleb let out a soft, hiccuping cry, so faint it barely reached me. That sound. It tore me open. I let out a shuddering breath. "Fine," I said, finally, the word tasting like defeat. "I'll try. But I can't promise anything. That's all I'm asking," Colt murmured. "Oh," as he gently lifted Caleb from the crib and placed the baby into my trembling arms. One thought echoed in my mind like a warning. Don't let this break you again. But I already knew it would. Caleb was lighter than I expected. His tiny body fit perfectly in the crook of my arm, his head resting against my chest. I could feel the faint warmth of his breath through the thin fabric of my sweater, each exhale soft and uneven. At first he squirmed, his lips trembling as he let out a weak cry. But as I shifted slightly, murmuring a soft, shaky shh, "It's okay," he stilled. And then he reached for me. His little fingers brushed against my hand, fumbling clumsily until they closed around my index finger. The grip was so small, so impossibly fragile, and yet it felt unrelenting. I froze. A flood of warmth surged through me, sharp and overwhelming, settling deep in my chest, where I thought nothing could grow again. I wanted to pull away, to remind myself this wasn't my child, this wasn't my life. But I didn't. I couldn't. The Colt hovered near the doorway, his broad frame outlined by the dim light of the hallway. He didn't say a word, just watched with an unreadable expression. "I don't know how long he'll stay calm," I said softly, my voice barely carrying across the room. "You've already done more than I could," he murmured. I didn't answer, because I didn't want to admit how natural this felt, how wrong it felt for it to feel natural. Caleb shifted slightly in my arms, letting out a faint sigh. His tiny fist tightened around my finger, as if he was anchoring himself to me. And in that moment, I felt it again. That ache, the one I thought I'd buried back in Seattle, along with the box of baby clothes I never got to use, and the ultrasound photos I couldn't bring myself to throw away. "You're not his mother," I told myself fiercely. "Don't let this confuse you. You're just helping until the storm passes." But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying. Something about the weight of him, the way his little body curled trustingly against mine, was pulling me under. "You should get some rest," Colt said after a long silence. I shook my head. "I'll stay a little longer. He's holding on." Colt nodded, but he didn't leave. I kept my eyes on Caleb, tracing the delicate curve of his cheek, the rise and fall of his tiny chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to feel this, but as his fingers curled tighter around mine, a single thought rose up unbidden, terrifying in its quiet certainty. I can't lose another child. The room was quiet now, save for the soft creak of the rocking chair, and Caleb's steady breathing against my chest. Colt lingered in the doorway, his arms folded across his chest. He hadn't moved for several minutes, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. "Thank you," he said at last. His voice was low, almost hesitant. I glanced at him briefly, then looked back down at Caleb. "Don't thank me yet. He's still fragile." "You got him to settle," Colt said. "That's more than I could do." Silence settled between us like a heavy blanket. I traced tiny circles on Caleb's back, with my thumb trying to focus on the rhythm of his breathing, instead of the man standing a few feet away. I didn't want to talk. Talking led to familiarity, and familiarity led to attachment, and I couldn't afford that. So you have kids?" Colt asked suddenly. The question hit me like a slap. I stiffened, tightening my hold on Caleb. "No," I said quickly. Too quickly. "Sorry," he said after a pause. "That wasn't fair to ask. It's fine." The words were automatic, but my voice came out thinner than I intended. Another long silence. Then Colt shifted his weight, his boots creaking softly on the floorboards. "I didn't expect to be raising him alone," he said, almost to himself. Claire. She was always the steady one, the one who knew what to do. I didn't reply. Part of me wanted to tell him he wasn't alone, not really. But another part, the part that still ached from loss, kept my lips pressed firmly shut. Caleb let out a soft sigh, his tiny fist loosening slightly around my finger. "He's strong," I murmured. Colt's gaze softened. Like his mother, I looked up then just for a moment, and our eyes met. For the first time since I arrived at Silver Creek, the storm in his expression seemed to ease just slightly. It wasn't a smile exactly, but there was something warmer there, something that scared me more than the howling wind outside. "I should put him back in his crib," I said, my voice quieter now. Colt nodded. "I'll get fresh blankets." As he stepped out of the room, I stood slowly careful not to wake Caleb. But even as I lowered the baby into the crib, I felt a strange emptiness settle in my arms. It was dangerous how quickly this tiny boy had found his way past the walls I'd spent years building. When Colt returned, he glanced at me briefly before adjusting the blankets around Caleb. "Will you stay a little longer?" he asked softly. The question hung in the air between us. I hesitated, then nodded once. "Just until the storm passes," I said. But even as I spoke, I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, him or myself. The storm hadn't let up. Wind screamed against the old farmhouse walls, making them creak like an old ship at sea. Somewhere in the distance, a tree branch cracked and slammed to the ground with a dull thud. I stayed seated in the nursery, my hands folded in my lap, as Caleb slept peacefully in his crib. Colt sat across from me in the rocking chair by the window. He hadn't said a word since he brought in the fresh blankets. The only sound between us was the soft rustle of the fire downstairs, and the baby's even breathing. Finally, Colt exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world pressed down on him. "I thought I could do this," he said quietly, his voice rough around the edges. I looked up, startled by the sound of his voice cutting through the storm. "Do what I asked. Be a father," he replied. His eyes were fixed on some point far beyond the frosted window pane. I thought I could handle it alone. Just me and him. No help. No one stepping in." He shook his head slightly, lips pressed tight. But I was wrong. I didn't know what to say. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound ashamed. He sounded tired. "I keep thinking about her," Colt murmured after a long pause. "About Claire. How easily she held him. How natural it was for her. And now his jaw tensed. Now I can't even get my own son to take a bottle." His hands clenched into fists in his lap, and for a moment I caught a flicker of something raw in his expression. Grief, fear, loneliness. "You're doing the best you can," I said softly. "Maybe." He let out a humorless laugh, the sound hollow in the quiet room. "But sometimes it feels like the best I can do isn't enough." His voice cracked on the last word, barely audible over the howl of the wind. I looked at him for a long moment. I wanted to tell him I understood, that I too had known what it felt like to hold a fragile life in my hands and fail to keep it safe. But the words caught in my throat. "You're not failing him," I said finally. "You're here. You're trying. That's more than a lot of kids get." Colt turned his head then, and for the first time, our eyes met fully in the dim light. There was no hardness in his gaze now, only a quiet plea. "I don't want to lose him too," he whispered. I felt something shift in my chest, dangerous and warm. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to feel this. But as I looked at this man, this father, fraying at the edges, I couldn't help but think, maybe I'm not as hollow as I thought. Morning light filtered weakly through the frost-laced window. I sat at the small kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. The house was quiet now. Caleb had finally drifted into a deep sleep, and Colt had stepped out to chop firewood before the next round of snow arrived. It should have felt peaceful, but inside my mind was anything but still. "This isn't your life," I told myself. "You're here for a job, that's all." The words felt hollow, like a mantra repeated too many times to mean anything anymore. I could still feel the ghost of Caleb's tiny hand gripping my finger as he slept last night. The warmth of him, the trust in that simple touch, it had worked its way under my skin. And Colt. The way his eyes softened when he looked at his son. the quiet plea in his voice when he whispered, "I don't want to lose him too." I shook my head hard, as if I could physically dislodge the thoughts. Atitatis. No attachments, no new scars. That had been my rule ever since Seattle. Since the night I stood in a half-painted nursery, clutching a pair of baby socks I'd never get to use. Since I learned how quickly a future can dissolve into ashes. I pushed back from the table and began pacing the small kitchen, hugging my arms tightly around my chest. The more time I spent here, the more dangerous this became. Silver Creek wasn't home. Colt and Caleb weren't my family. I couldn't let them feel like they were. The floor creaked behind me. Couldn't sleep. Colt's voice was quiet, almost tentative. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, snow melting off his boots in small puddles. Didn't even try, I admitted. "Yeah," he said softly. "Me neither." He stepped further into the room, rubbing his palms together for warmth. "You don't have to stay, you know," Colt said after a moment. "I can manage from here." I let out a bitter laugh. "Can you—" His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. "I'm trying," he said finally. "I know," I replied, my voice softer now. For a long moment, we stood there in silence. I wanted to tell him I'd leave as soon as the roads cleared, that this whatever fragile rhythm we'd fallen into couldn't last. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to leave. Don't get lured in June. I warned myself again. Don't mistake this for belonging. But a small, traitorous part of me whispered, what if it is? The knock on the door was sharp, deliberate, and so unexpected that I nearly dropped the mug in my hands. Colt appeared in the hallway a second later, wiping his hands on a rag. He exchanged a quick glance with me before moving to answer it. When he pulled the door open, the cold air swept in along with a woman I'd never seen before. She was striking in that timeless way, hair pinned back in a neat twist wool coat, tailored perfectly to her frame, and eyes as sharp as frost. "Nathan," she said curtly. Eleanor Colt replied, his voice low, cautious. Eleanor's gaze flicked past him and landed on me, and this must be June Carter. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm helping with Caleb." "Helping," she repeated, tasting the word like it was foreign. Interesting. There was no warmth in her tone. Colt stepped aside as Eleanor shrugged off her coat and entered the house. She moved with the kind of authority that didn't need permission. "I heard the storm trapped you out here," she said. "I brought some supplies." She gestured vaguely to the bag in her hand before setting it on the counter. "Thanks," Colt murmured. Her sharp green eyes didn't leave me for a second. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "Since the storm started," I said simply. "And before that, you're from Cedar Hollow. I grew up here. Yes. I don't remember seeing you around. I left a long time ago." Eleanor hummed clearly, filing that away. Then, without preamble, she said, "Claire hasn't been gone long." The air in the room shifted. I straightened instinctively, clutching my sweater tight. "I know," I said quietly. "Do you?" Her tone was sharper now. "Because it seems to me you've made yourself quite comfortable in this house." Eleanor Colt started. But she raised a hand to stop him. "I'm not trying to be cruel," she said, her voice softer, but no less pointed. "I'm trying to protect my family. Nathan is still grieving. Don't mistake his gratitude for something more." Her words hit harder than I expected. "I never asked for this," I said finally. "I didn't come here to take anyone's place." "Good," Eleanor said crisply, "because no one could." She adjusted her scarf, her expression unreadable. "I'll check in again after the storm." Without another word, she turned and walked out, her boots clicking against the porch steps. The door closed with a dull thud. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Colt let out a breath and raked a hand through his hair. She doesn't mean it the way it sounds. But I wasn't sure I believed that. Because the truth was, Eleanor's words had struck a nerve. And worse, a small part of me wondered if she was right. The door had barely clicked shut behind Eleanor when I felt the heat rising in my chest. Her words replayed in my head on an endless loop. Don't mistake his gratitude for something more. Don't let him mistake it either. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter until my knuckles whitened. How dare she answer? I stormed back to the guest room and yanked open the small closet. My coat was still damp from last night, but I didn't care. She thought she knew me. She thought I was here to replace someone, to slide into a life that wasn't mine. But she was wrong. I wasn't here for them. I wasn't here for him. I was here because I needed a paycheck. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The sound of Caleb's soft coo carried down the hallway. I froze my hand on my suitcase. The memory of his tiny fingers clutching mine flickered in my mind, as vivid as if it had happened seconds ago. Don't let this get under your skin, I told myself. You've done enough. You can leave with your head held high. There was a knock at the doorframe. Colt stood there, one hand braced against the wood, his expression unreadable. "You're packing." "Yes," I said curtly. "As soon as the roads are clear. I'm leaving." "You don't have to," he said quietly. "Yes, I do." I shot back harsher than I intended. His jaw tightened. "Eleanor doesn't speak for me." "She doesn't have to," I said. "She's right. I don't belong here." We stood in silence for a moment, the tension between us thick as the storm outside. Finally, Colt said, "If you want to go, I won't stop you. But don't let her scare you off. It's not about her." I said softer now. "It's about me. I can't do this." "Do what?" "Pretend," I whispered. "Pretend this is temporary. Pretend it doesn't mean anything." Colt stepped forward slightly, his voice low. "Maybe it doesn't have to be pretend." I looked away, my fingers tightening around the handle of my suitcase. "This isn't my life, Colt," I said. "It never was." He didn't argue. He just nodded once his shoulders heavy. "I'll have Harris check the roads in the morning," he said finally. "If they're clear, I'll drive you to town." "Fine," I said. But as his footsteps faded down the hall, a strange ache settled in my chest. Because for all my words, I wasn't sure leaving would feel like winning. It might feel like breaking all over again. I zipped the suitcase shut with a sharp final tug. The sound cut through the quiet room like a knife louder than it should have been. This was it. As soon as the roads cleared, I'd be gone. Back to my own life, whatever scraps of it I could still claim in Seattle. I glanced around the guest room. The walls were bare, impersonal. No photos, no keepsakes. Leaving should have been easy. So why did it feel like every step toward the door was weighted with lead? I grabbed my coat off the bed and shoved my arms through the sleeves. 2 weeks, I murmured under my breath. That's all this was ever supposed to be. Then I heard it. A cry. Thin at first, almost hesitant. Then louder, sharper. Caleb. I froze, my fingers still clutching the coat zipper. He cried again, longer this time, the sound breaking midway like his little lungs couldn't keep up. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't go in there, June. Yet the cries didn't stop. They pierced the walls, winding their way under my skin, until I felt them in my chest, like a physical ache. I tried to shake it off. Colt's there, I whispered. It's not my job anymore. He'll figure it out. But even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe a word. I sat back down on the edge of the bed, my coat still half-zipped. The cries had softened into hiccuping sobs, now hoarse, fragile, and somehow worse than the full-throated wails from before. And just like that night in the nursery, I saw my own son's face again. The way he'd flailed in the incubator, tiny fists too weak to hold on. The way his cries had faded to nothing. The memory struck like a blow to the ribs. I pressed my palms hard against my knees. Don't do this, I murmured to myself. Don't make this harder than it already is. But the sound of Caleb's cryings kept tugging at me, each note sharper than the last. The floor creaked outside. Then Colt's deep voice low, but frayed at the edges. He won't settle. I've tried everything. I should have stayed put. I should have waited for Colt to walk away to handle it on his own. But my body moved before my mind caught up. My hand was on the doorknob. And even as I told myself this was a mistake, I opened the door anyway. The nursery was dimly lit shadows from the flickering lamp stretching long across the floor. Caleb's cheeks were flushed a deep pink, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. I pressed the back of my hand to his forehead and felt the heat radiating from his skin. 102. I muttered, checking the thermometer again. Not dangerously high, but enough to make him miserable. Colt stood behind me, his arms crossed tight over his chest. I could feel the tension rolling off him like heat from a fire. Oh, fucking, is it bad? He asked, his voice low and tight. Not yet, I said honestly. But if we don't keep the fever down, it could be. I reached for the cool washcloth in the basin and dabbed gently at Caleb's forehead. He whimpered softly, his tiny fingers twitching. Yidis. Colt raked a hand through his hair. I've been trying for hours. Nothing works. He just cries and I don't know what to do. I looked up at him. You're doing your best, I said quietly. Is it enough? He shot back, his voice breaking slightly. Because it sure doesn't feel like it. I didn't answer, because deep down, I knew what it was like to give everything you had, and still feel like you were failing. "Let me take him tonight," I said finally. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Colt hesitated. "You don't have to." I know, I cut in gently. "But I want to." For a moment, he just stood there staring at me like he didn't know whether to argue or collapse. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you," he murmured. I settled into the rocking chair, cradling Caleb against my chest. His small body felt unbearably warm, his breaths coming in soft, shallow puffs. "Easy, little one," I whispered. "We'll get you through this." Colt lingered in the doorway, his hand braced against the frame. "I should have asked sooner," he said suddenly. "Asked what?" "For you to stay," he admitted. "I thought I could handle it. That it was better for Caleb if I kept things simple. But I was wrong." I swallowed hard, focusing on the rhythm of the chair as I rocked. "Colt, please," he said quietly. "I know you're planning to leave, and I can't stop you. But if you could stay just a few more days, until the roads are fully clear, until he's stronger." His voice cracked. "I'll pay you triple your contract, whatever it takes. Just don't walk out yet." Neandras. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of Caleb's small hand resting against my collarbone. "This isn't about money," I said softly. "I know," Colt whispered, "but I don't know what else to offer." The rocking chair creaked as I shifted, staring down at Caleb's flushed face. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, to run, before this became harder than it already was. But then Caleb let out a soft sigh, curling closer against me, as if he'd found some small measure of comfort. And just like that, my resolve cracked. "3 days," I said, finally. "That's all I can promise." 3 days, Colt echoed, his voice raw with relief. "Thank you." The house had fallen silent. Caleb finally slept, his fever breaking after hours of restlessness. I'd stayed with him until his little chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, then slipped quietly downstairs. Colt was sitting by the fireplace, a half-empty mug of coffee cooling on the table beside him. The glow of the flames threw soft shadows across his face, catching in the lines, etched deep around his eyes. He didn't look up when I entered. I hesitated at the edge of the room. "You should get some rest," I said softly. "So should you," he murmured, his voice low and tired. I sat down in the armchair across from him, pulling my sweater tighter around me. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire and the faint howl of wind against the windows. Then I noticed his hands. He was turning a simple gold band between his fingers over and over the metal, catching the firelight with every rotation. His wedding ring. I looked away, suddenly feeling like I'd intruded on something private. "I keep doing this," Colt said quietly, his gaze fixed on the ring, turning it, holding it. Like if I let go, she'll slip away completely. His voice cracked on the last words. "'Cause you loved her," I said gently. He nodded, more than I knew how to say. Claire was everything. Strong, steady. She made this house feel alive. He went silent for a moment, then added, "Since she's been gone, I've been moving through the days like a ghost, taking care of Caleb because I have to, not because I know how. I opened my mouth to respond, but couldn't find the right words. Saknesoseg. Colt stared at the ring for a moment longer. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he slipped it off his finger and set it carefully on the table. The small sound of metal against wood felt louder than it should have. When he finally looked up, our eyes met. And for the first time since I arrived at Silver Creek, I didn't see the hardened rancher everyone else probably saw. I saw a man drowning quietly in his own grief. I thought my heart died with her, he whispered. But tonight, watching you with Caleb... His voice trailed off, and he looked down as if ashamed. I don't know what this is, he admitted, but for the first time in months, it doesn't feel like I'm completely alone. I didn't speak. I couldn't, because the words I'd rehearsed in my head about how I was only here temporarily, about how this wasn't my life, suddenly felt brittle and false. The fire popped softly, filling the silence between us, and though neither of us moved, the air seemed to shift warmer, heavier, as if we were both standing on the edge of something too fragile to name. The morning light seeped gently through the curtains, pale and hesitant, as though even the sun was wary of disturbing the quiet in this house. Caleb slept soundly in the crib, his cheeks no longer flushed with fever, but soft and rosy, his little mouth forming an O as he dreamed. Colt stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the crib. "He looks stronger today," he murmured. "He is," I said softly. "Kids are resilient like that." There was a long silence between us, but this time it didn't feel heavy. For the first time since I stepped into Silver Creek, the tension in my chest seemed to ease just a little. We moved to the kitchen after checking on Caleb. The air smelled faintly of coffee and pine wood from the fire Colt had stoked earlier. He poured 2 mugs and set one in front of me. "You don't talk much about yourself," Colt said after a moment, his voice careful, almost tentative. "There's not much to tell," I replied, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic. I don't believe that he said gently. People who don't talk usually have the most to say. I hesitated. For so long I'd kept my story locked tight, buried under layers of work and distance. But here, in this quiet kitchen, with Colt's steady gaze on me, the lock seemed to loosen. His name was Noah. I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Colt didn't flinch. He didn't ask questions. He just listened. I was 24 when I found out I was pregnant, I continued. It wasn't planned. But once I heard his heartbeat for the first time, I couldn't imagine life without him. I stared down into my coffee. I was 5 months along when the complications started. They told me there wasn't much they could do, that sometimes these things just happen. The memory surfaced unbidden. The sterile smell of the hospital, the cold grip of the nurse's hand on mine, the tiny, fragile weight of Noah in my arms for the first and only time. I held him for 15 minutes, I said softly, long enough to count all 10 fingers and all 10 toes, long enough to feel his chest rise and fall, and then nothing. Colt's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry," he said simply. I let out a shaky breath. I thought the pain would dull with time, that the ache would fade, but some holes never close. For a long moment, Colt didn't speak. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "I thought I knew grief before Claire passed. I didn't. Not really. It changes you in ways you can't explain." Our eyes met across the table, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was drowning in my loss alone. The parlor was warm, the scent of old wood and faint polish lingering in the air. I sat at the Steinway, my fingers brushing the keys lightly. It had been years since I'd played, but somehow my hands still remembered like a muscle memory carved deep into my skin. A soft, hesitant chord echoed in the room, filling the silence with something gentle and alive. Colt stood near the doorway, arms crossed loosely as he watched. "You play," he said quietly, almost like a question. "A little," I replied. "My mom made me take lessons as a kid. I hated it then, but now, I guess it feels like a piece of home I didn't realize I missed." Caleb shifted slightly in the bassinet nearby, but didn't wake. His tiny hands were curled into fists, his breath steady and even. I kept my voice low, not wanting to disturb him. "He looks so peaceful," I murmured. "Thanks to you," Colt said softly. I pressed another key, letting the note linger in the air. "You said Claire used to play?" I asked. "She did," he replied. "She'd sit right where you're sitting now, even late at night. Said music calmed her nerves when life felt too heavy." He smiled faintly at the memory, and for the first time, it didn't seem to carry the sharp edge of grief. "Do you miss it? The music?" I asked. "I miss a lot of things," Colt admitted. "But yeah, the sound of this room when she played, it made the house feel full." I nodded understanding in a way words couldn't capture. The house had been too quiet when I first arrived. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but hollow. Now, even this hesitant tune felt like it was stitching something back together. Colt stepped closer, resting one hand lightly on the top of the piano. "Play something," he said gently. "I'm rusty. Doesn't matter." I took a deep breath and let my fingers find an old tune. The melody wavered at first, clumsy and unsure, then steadied as I sank into it. Colt didn't say anything. He just listened. When the last note faded, he let out a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding. "That was beautiful," he murmured. "It's not much," I said, glancing down at my hands. "It's more than you think." I looked up, meeting his gaze in the soft glow of the firelight. There was no wall between us in that moment. No grief, no guilt. Just two people sitting in a quiet room sharing something they hadn't expected to find again. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe I wasn't here by accident after all. The last note from the piano lingered in the warm air before fading into silence. Colt was still standing beside me, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the piano, his gaze steady and unreadable. Caleb shifted softly in the bassinet nearby, letting out a tiny sigh before settling back into sleep. The gentle sound seemed to fill the room, delicate and grounding. "You have a way of calming him," Colt murmured. I didn't look up. "It's nothing special, just patience." "It is special," he said quietly. "It's more than I've been able to give him lately." Something in his tone made my chest tighten. "Colt," I began, but the words faltered on my tongue. He shifted closer, so close I could feel the faint warmth radiating from his arm. "June," he said softly. I finally turned my head to meet his gaze. The look in his eyes wasn't the guarded, grieving man I'd met when I arrived. This was different. Softer, searching, vulnerable, in a way that made my pulse quicken. And then, almost hesitantly, his hand brushed against mine, where it rested on the piano bench. It wasn't a grand gesture, just the lightest touch, like he was asking for permission. My breath caught. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to lean into that touch, to let myself believe in the warmth it offered, but instead, I pulled my hand back. I can't," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. Colt froze. "I can't be what you're looking for." I continued forcing the words out, even as my chest ached. "I can't replace Claire, and I won't try." His jaw tightened slightly, but his eyes never left mine. "I'm not asking you to replace her," he said quietly. "I know no one could." "Then what are you asking?" I whispered. He looked down for a moment, his shoulders sagging. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just know that when you're here, the house doesn't feel so empty." "To say." I stood abruptly, needing space, air, anything to steady the storm building inside me. "Colt, I came here to do a job. That's all. When the road's clear, I'm leaving." "I know," he said, his voice low. The words were quiet, but they landed between us like a stone in still water. "Saltido." I stepped toward the doorway, pausing only to glance back at Caleb. He was still sleeping soundly, unaware of the cracks forming around him. "It's good night, Colt," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Good night, June." But as I walked away, my hand still tingled faintly where his fingers had brushed mine, and I hated how much I already missed that warmth. The morning sun streamed faintly through the kitchen window, casting long golden stripes across the worn wooden floor. I sat at the table suitcase, already packed and waiting by the door. This time, it wasn't just talk. The roads were clear. The storm had passed. Caleb's fever had broken 2 nights ago, and now he was eating, sleeping, thriving. My job here was done. So why did it feel like I was walking away from more than a temporary contract? I wrapped my hands around the chipped coffee mug, letting the warmth seep into my palms. Leave before it's too late, I told myself. Before this feels like home. Before they feel like yours. But no matter how many times I whispered it like a prayer, my feet stayed rooted to the floor. I could still feel Caleb's tiny hand curled around my finger as he drifted off to sleep last night. And worse, I could still feel the ghost of Colt's touch, that fleeting moment on the piano bench when his fingers brushed mine. This isn't your life, June. Don't let yourself believe it could be. The footsteps on the stairs pulled me from my thoughts. Colt entered the kitchen carrying Caleb against his chest. The baby's cheeks were flushed, but this time with health, not fever. "Good morning," Colt said softly. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. Caleb let out a happy squeal and reached toward me with chubby little fingers. I froze. Every instinct screamed to step forward to scoop him up and hold him close one last time. But instead, I tightened my grip on the coffee mug and stayed in my chair. Colt noticed the packed suitcase by the door. His jaw tensed slightly. "You're leaving today," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said quietly. "The roads are open now. It's time." "Oh." The words felt heavy in my mouth like I was trying to swallow glass. Colt nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You've done more for us than I could ever repay," he said. "You don't owe me anything," I replied. But we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Attacks, Caleb babbled again, still reaching toward me. This time, I couldn't stop myself. I stood and gently took him from Colt's arms, holding him close. The baby nestled against my shoulder with a contented sigh, as if he didn't understand this was goodbye. I closed my eyes, breathing in his soft, powdery scent, and in that moment, I felt my resolve crack. How do you leave when your heart already stayed behind? I was still holding Caleb when a knock sounded at the door, firm, deliberate, but without the sharpness I remembered. Colt glanced at me, then shifted Caleb gently from my arms. "That'll be her," he murmured. I didn't have to ask who. When Colt opened the door, Eleanor stood on the porch, her wool coat buttoned neatly against the cold. But this time, her sharp green eyes didn't pierce me like before. There was no judgment in her expression, only something softer. "May I come in?" she asked. "Of course," Colt said quietly, stepping aside. Eleanor's gaze swept briefly across the room before landing on me. "You're still here," she said. Her voice calm, almost surprised. "Yes," I replied, clutching the edge of my sweater. I was just about to leave. She stepped closer, unbuttoning her gloves one finger at a time. "I wasn't fair to you," before she said simply. The admission caught me off guard. I was protecting my son and my grandson the only way I knew how she continued. But in doing so, I misjudged you. I said, nothing unsure where this was going. Eleanor's eyes flicked toward Colt, who was rocking Caleb gently in his arms. "I see it now," she said softly, "the way Nathan looks at you. The way Caleb quiets in your presence." Her lips curved in the faintest smile. "Carter, he's not the same man he was a month ago, and it's because of you." The words settled in the air between us like falling snow, quiet, soft, but impossible to ignore. "I didn't come here to change anything," I said carefully, "or anyone. And yet, you did," Eleanor replied. "You gave them both something I couldn't hope." I looked away, my chest tightening. Hope. The one thing I'd spent years denying myself because hoping meant leaving room for the kind of loss I wasn't sure I could survive again. Eleanor placed a gloved hand on my arm, startling me. "You don't have to replace Claire to be important to them," she said gently. "I can see that now. Akis." For a long moment, I didn't trust myself to speak. When I finally found my voice, it came out quiet, almost broken. "I don't know if I can give them what they need." "You already have," Eleanor said. "Maybe it's time you asked yourself if they're giving you what you need too." The sound of Caleb's soft babble drew my gaze back to him. He was staring at me from Colt's arms, his tiny hand reaching in my direction, as if he understood the weight of the choice pressing on my heart. The suitcase waited by the door, like a silent witness, its zipper pulled tight, as if it too sensed my hesitation. I stood frozen, one hand resting on the handle, my chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. This is the right thing to do, I told myself for the 100th time. Leave now, before this gets any harder. But the words felt brittle hollow. Behind me, Colt murmured softly to Caleb as he adjusted him on his hip. The baby gurgled in response, his bright eyes fixed on me. "Say goodbye, buddy," Colt said gently. "June's heading out now." "Go, sing. Dared in tust." I turned my head, forcing a small, shaky smile. "Be good, okay?" I whispered. "Oh, sauting. Di Signe." And then it happened. A sound so soft, I almost thought I imagined it. "Mama." My heart stopped. I blinked, staring at Caleb, as his tiny lips shaped the word again. "Mama." Colt froze, his eyes snapping to mine. We both stood there in stunned silence as Caleb reached out a chubby little hand toward me, his face lighting up with a gummy smile. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet house, filling every corner, every crack in my carefully built walls. "So, no," I whispered, shaking my head. "No. I'm not." But my voice broke the denial shattering on my tongue. Colt's voice was low, almost reverent. He's never said that before. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the suitcase handle until my knuckles turned white. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to matter this much. But Caleb didn't care about the rules I'd set for myself. To him, I wasn't a placeholder or a passing stranger. I was Mama. My hand trembled as I let go of the suitcase. The sound of it hitting the floor was soft, but it felt like a thunderclap in my chest. Colt took a step forward, his voice gentle but steady. "You don't have to run anymore, June." I turned toward him, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. "This isn't my family," I whispered, though the words felt weaker now, like I was trying to convince myself more than him. "Maybe not," Colt said quietly, "but you're already a part of us, whether you meant to be or not." Caleb babbled again, still reaching for me, his little fingers opening and closing like he was trying to pull me back. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. Leaving wouldn't just break my heart. It would break his, too. The suitcase was back in my hand. Its weight felt heavier than it should have, as though all the questions swirling in my head had settled inside it, dragging me down with every step. The front door loomed ahead, tall and unassuming. Beyond it lay the road back to Seattle. Back to the quiet, predictable life I'd been trying to rebuild. You said you'd never get attached again, I reminded myself. This was supposed to be temporary, so why did my chest feel so tight I could barely breathe? And behind me, I heard Colt's footsteps. Slow, deliberate. "You're really leaving?" he asked, his voice low but steady. I tightened my grip on the suitcase handle. "I have to," I said quietly. "Do you—" His question cut through the air like a blade. I turned halfway, meeting his gaze over my shoulder. "I was never supposed to stay," I whispered. "This isn't my life, Colt. It's yours. And Caleb's." But even as the words left my lips, they rang hollow, because deep down, I knew they weren't true anymore. The Colt took another step closer, his voice softer now. "You keep saying that, but you've already become part of this life. Part of us." I shook my head, blinking hard against the sting in my eyes. "No, Claire. This isn't about Claire," he said firmly. "This is about you. About Caleb. About me." Silence settled between us, heavy and fragile. "I can't replace her," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I don't want you to," Colt replied. "I don't need you to fill her place. I want you to stay, because you're you." My hand trembled on the door handle. Outside, the wind had quieted. The world beyond the door seemed still waiting. One step forward, and I could leave all of this behind. The late-night feedings, the warmth of Caleb's tiny fingers curled around mine, the way Colt's eyes softened when he looked at me. The one step forward, and I'd never have to risk my heart again. But one step back. One step back. And I'd be choosing something terrifying. Something real. At this. Colt's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "You don't have to decide right now," he said gently. "But if you walk out that door, make sure it's what you really want." I closed my eyes, my fingers tightening on the handle. And for the first time in years, I asked myself the question I'd been too afraid to face. What if I want to stay? My fingers still rested on the door handle, but my mind was already 1,000 miles away. Seattle. I pictured my apartment, the one I'd left behind 2 weeks ago, with its sterile white walls and faint smell of cleaning products that never seemed to fade. The living room was tidy, almost too tidy. A throw blanket folded neatly on the arm of the couch. A half-empty bookshelf, lined with medical journals instead of photo frames. The nursery door was always shut. I'd tried to make it a home once, make it a us, painted the walls, a soft yellow, assembled a crib with trembling hands, and stacked tiny onesies in a drawer, like talismans against all my fears. But all those things were gone now, packed away into boxes I couldn't bring myself to open. I remembered the nights I spent sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the dark ceiling, the silence pressing in like a living thing. No laughter, no footsteps on creaking floorboards, no soft baby sighs or gummy smiles, just me alone with my ghosts. A gust of wind rattled the door in front of me, snapping me back to Silver Creek. Here the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and baby powder. From the kitchen came the sound of Colt humming low under his breath as he washed bottles. And upstairs Caleb's soft babble floated down, filling the house with a life and warmth I hadn't realized I'd missed so badly. The contrast between the two places hit me like a punch to the chest. Seattle had been my sanctuary, but this place, this house, these people felt alive, felt like something I didn't even dare name. I tightened my grip on the suitcase handle, trying to ground myself. "This isn't real," I whispered under my breath. "This isn't mine." But wasn't that the problem? It wasn't mine, and yet a small, stubborn part of me wanted it to be. In my mind's eye, I saw Caleb's tiny hand reaching for me as he spoke that single word for the first time, "Mama." And I heard Colt's voice, quiet but steady. "You don't have to replace her. I just want you to stay, because you're you." I pressed my forehead against the cool wood of the door, fighting back tears. Seattle had felt safe, because nothing there could hurt me anymore. But here was dangerous. Here was alive. Which is worse, I asked myself, staying and risking my heart again, or leaving and realizing it had already been stolen? Behind me, the sound of Colt's footsteps drew closer. "June," he said softly. I didn't turn. Not yet, because I didn't know if I had the strength to face the answer in his eyes. "June." His voice was closer now, low and steady. I felt Colt's presence behind me. Before I saw him, the faint heat radiating from his body, as he stopped just a step away. "You're shaking," he said softly. I glanced down and realized my hand was trembling on the suitcase handle. "Don't," I whispered, though. I wasn't sure if it was meant for him or myself. "Don't," what he asked, gently. "Don't make this harder than it already is." The Colt's hand hovered near mine, not touching, but close enough to feel. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," he said. "You don't have to anymore." "I can't stay out of pity," I said hoarsely, "or obligation." "Then don't." Yet the words hung between us, simple but steady. "Don't stay for him," Colt continued. "And don't stay for me." I turned slightly enough to see his face in the dim light. "Then why?" I whispered. "Stay because you want to," Colt said. "Stay because this," he gestured softly between us, "feels like something worth holding on to." His voice cracked just slightly. "Don't stay because you feel like you should, June. Stay because you believe we're worth the risk." For a moment, everything in me stilled. The storm inside my chest, the questions, the fear, they all quieted, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Slowly, I loosened my grip on the suitcase handle. It slipped from my fingers and hit the floor with a soft, dull thud. Colt exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. His eyes searched mine, not demanding, not pleading, just waiting. "This isn't easy," I said quietly. "I'm scared." "So am I," Colt admitted. "But maybe that's how we know it's real." Isham behind us, Caleb babbled softly from the bassinet, as if sensing the shift in the room. Colt glanced at his son, then back at me. "I'm not asking for forever," he said. "I'm asking for a chance. Je suis contentas. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of his words settle into all the broken pieces I'd carried for so long. And for the first time in years, the idea of staying didn't feel like surrender. It felt like hope. When I opened my eyes, Colt was still there, still waiting, and I realized I wasn't running anymore. Yes, I whispered. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Then, let's figure it out, he said softly. Together. Outside, the wind had calmed, but inside the quiet felt alive, like the beginning of something new. The piano keys felt warm beneath my fingers as I played a simple melody, the kind that lingered softly in the air, like sunlight through lace curtains. Caleb sat on the rug nearby chubby hands, clapping wildly, his little face bright with laughter. Every giggle he let out seemed to fill the house, bouncing off the walls and seeping into every crack that had once been silent and still. Again, Mama. He squealed, his voice high and sweet. I laughed, my heart swelling at the sound of that word, Mama. It still caught me off guard sometimes, the way he said it so easily now. But it felt right. It felt like home. From behind me, I felt Colt's presence before I saw him. His hand rested lightly on my shoulder, warm and steady. You're spoiling him, he teased softly. I glanced up at him, my lips tugging into a smile. That's my job now, isn't it? Colt's eyes softened as he looked from me to Caleb. There was no trace of the grief that had once haunted his face, no heaviness in his shoulders, only a quiet contentment that had taken root and grown strong over the past year. I stopped playing for a moment, turning to face him fully. You okay? I asked gently. He nodded, his fingers brushing lightly against mine, where they rested on the keys. Better than okay, Colt said. I never thought I'd have this again. Caleb let out another delighted squeal, crawling over to Colt and tugging at his pant leg. Colt scooped him up effortlessly, holding him high above his head as the boy erupted into peals of laughter. I watched them together, my chest tightening, not with fear, but with something warmer, something I didn't think I'd ever feel again. Belonging. Colt met my gaze over Caleb's tiny head, his eyes gentle and unguarded, in a way I still wasn't entirely used to. Thank you, he said quietly, for what I asked, for giving us both a reason to smile again. I reached out, brushing my fingers over Caleb's downy hair. You gave me the same thing I murmured. The three of us stood there in the golden light streaming through the window, the house alive with warmth and laughter. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was too busy holding on to what I'd found.